Do vegetarians and vegans live longer than similarly health-conscious meat eaters? No. In fact, in today's video, we're going to find out that it's even worse than that. Health-conscious vegetarians and vegans don't even live longer than non-health-conscious meat eaters. Stick around for about a half an hour and I can promise you that we will laugh, we will cry, and we will poke some holes in vegan lies. What's up, family? It's your boy Danny, fresh in the flesh, on YouTube's most criminally underrated channel, back once again reminding you that you are beautiful, capable, and strong, which means that you are good enough for whatever fate cooks up and sends your way. And you're gonna stay that way because you are gonna eat meat, move weight, and get her done, son. Aha! If this is your first time here and you want to learn how to make sense of your experience and Pareto optimize your life, well, stick around and find out. Rolling. You listen to any mainstream nutritional advice, you'll often hear that you need to limit your saturated fat intake on account of the fact that it might be atherogenic. What's it? Or, that it might be implicated as a causative factor in causing cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease or whatever you prefer. Heart attacks, okay? This interpretation of the data, or this story, which is a term that we prefer around these parts, is slowly being rewritten, but it still gets thrown around quite a bit. In fact, if you listen to science-savvy vegans, of which there are many, don't laugh, this is the story that you will hear from them as well. They tend to downplay, in fact, their anti-animal foods bias, and they make it more about saturated fat because this happens to be really prevalent in animal products, although really, really prevalent in coconut. These science-savvy vegans tend to focus on saturated fat with the understanding that saturated fat will raise cholesterol, with the understanding that that will mean that there's more LDL, which is bad cholesterol, floating around your body, which will mean that you are more likely to have a cardiovascular event or incident or maybe even death. The less savvy vegans, or the vegoons, are too busy blathering on about the meat rotting in your colon to even attempt to deal honestly with the data or to craft a coherent, compelling, consistent narrative about said data. Newsflash for the unsavvy vegans, meat doesn't even make it to your colon. It's already been completely digested before it has a chance or an opportunity to reach your colon. However, you know what does rot in your colon? That's right, vegetables. Fiber, to be specific. Now, technically, it doesn't rot in your colon. It's just being digested by bacteria. And of course, digested by bacteria is just a fancy way of saying rot. This does raise an interesting question, or pose an interesting question, and that is it more likely that meat, which doesn't even make it to your colon, is causing colon cancer, or the thing that actually makes it to your colon and sits around for a while in there? Inquiring minds want to know. The French paradox. The battle over saturated fat has been raging for like 80 years now, but sometime in the 1980s, that's when I was born. Sometime in the 1980s, people started talking about this thing called the French paradox. The French paradox was and is, or I guess maybe just was, the epidemiological observation that French people, despite having a relatively high intake of saturated fat, had a relatively low rate of CVD disease or CHD disease. We'll just say, you know what, for today's episode, we're just gonna say CVD as an umbrella term. No, we have to be specific. We'll go back and forth between CVD, cardiovascular disease, and CHD, coronary heart disease. But anyway, the French paradox is the epidemiological observation that the French have a low rate of this thing, CHD, despite having a diet that's relatively rich in saturated fats. How can this be, wondered the folks who believed in the saturated fat is atherogenic paradigm? If the thesis linking saturated fat consumption or increased saturated fat consumption to coronary heart disease is valid, then the French ought to have a higher or increased rate of coronary heart disease than comparable countries where saturated fat consumption happens to be lower. Some have suggested that the French paradox is an illusion created in part simply by the way that French people or French health authorities happen to gather health statistics. That is basically they're accusing the Frenchies of underreporting. Others have suggested that the French paradox is an illusion created at least in part by this notion or this idea that the French have recently increased their saturated fat. Of course, this was in the 80s we were talking about, and that the death rates were sure to eventually increase from coronary heart disease at a later time. That is, it would catch up with the French people. Catch up. What do the papa tomatoes say to the baby tomato? Catch up. Dang, I forgot the whole joke. Okay, well, if that's the case, then how do we explain all of these other countries with very high rates of saturated fat consumption and very low rates of coronary heart disease mortality or CHD mortality? Just look at all these countries in this graph that have a very high percentage of total energy intake coming from saturated fat. In fact, actually, if you look at this line, you can see this sort of linear progression. And it's a little bit scattered, but as you increase the percentage of saturated fat in the diet, you decrease the incidence of CHD mortality. In fact, here, let's just look at this. This is from Diet Doctor. They actually plugged in the actual country names onto this same piece of data. Since now we're looking at mortality, right? CHD mortality and not just CHD incidences, you could say, especially when you look at the names of those other countries further up the graph where there's less saturated fat consumption, you could say, well, it's just because they're all rich countries, Daniel. That's why they're not dying, right? The health authorities or doctors are intervening. The medical industrial complex is intervening in time to save these people, to get them out there and stuff them more full of toxic saturated fat. Let me just read you a quote so we can address this issue. This is from a letter to the editor of the British Journal of Nutrition that is a response to a response. There was a lengthy debate in the journal. It was a big old debate about what story to tell about all the data regarding saturated fat and coronary heart disease. And I mean all the data, not just the data plotted in this figure. In conclusion, here we go, quoting from the letter. In conclusion, Peterson et al. Provide some ecological data describing changes in saturated fatty acid intake, so we'll just call saturated fat intake over time, and no correlations with CHD were made in any of the articles referred to. This is their criticism of the letter they received. Further intakes of saturated fatty acids correlated well with intakes of other types of fat. Other ecological correlations show that European countries with the highest saturated fat intake have the lowest mortality rates from CHD. That's what we saw in that scatter plot. At least one fairly recent report is available, though, which allows ecological data to be directly correlated. In 2008, the European Cardiovascular Disease Statistics were published. The report provided data about per capita saturated fatty acid intake in 1998 and annual CHD death rates from 1972 to 2005 for adults aged 0 to 64 years. Based on these data, saturated fat intake in 1998 was inversely correlated to CHD mortality in 1998 among males for all countries with available data for this year. Findings were similar for women and for both CHD and stroke endpoints. These were the results, again, that were plotted on the figure that we just looked at. But now it gets really interesting when they start talking about all of the data. U.S. mortality rates from diseases of the heart in 1996 were approximately the same as those that prevailed a century earlier. That would be 1896, long before statin use or dietary advice. Systematic reviews of prospective cohort studies show a consistent lack of an association between saturated fatty acid intake and coronary heart disease. These reviews also show that replacing saturated fat with PUFAs may decrease CHD risk, and that replacing saturated fat with MUFAs, or monounsaturated fatty acids, or carbohydrates might even increase CHD risk. Randomized trials substituting dietary fats suggest a strong correlation between the effect size and the possibility of confounding by other mostly dietary variables. That means it's impossible to tease apart all this data. Results from prospective cohort studies show that the effects from these dietary variables on CHD may fully explain the effects observed in the randomized trials. Finally, results from both prospective cohort and randomized trials show that changes in serum cholesterol caused by dietary changes do not predict effects on CHD in a reliable way. Peterson et al. Seem to interpret epidemiological research and clinical trials from the perspective that saturated fatty acid intake increases cholesterol, and that cholesterol increases coronary heart disease, and so therefore saturated fatty acid intake increases coronary heart disease. You'll see that this causal chain interpretation is very common and very incorrect. It's the causal chain that we talked about in the beginning of this video. But if we omit the effects on cholesterol when judging the evidence for an association between saturated fatty acid intake and coronary heart disease, none of the different types of studies seem to be able to provide reliable evidence that SFA increases CHD. Convincing evidence for an association would mean that all different lines of evidence show an association between saturated fatty acid intake and coronary heart disease, preferably beyond any level of doubt. Clearly, an overview of the scientific evidence shows suggestive evidence for an association at most. Why did you switch to CHD mortality, Danny, when we were talking about incidences? Because, and feel free to disagree with me here, but I believe that that's the really incredibly important endpoint that we should be talking about, is whether or not you're gonna die. I mean, you're gonna die, but you know what I'm saying. Actually, let's take an even broader view of mortality in general. Can we please talk about the life expectancy in saturated fat guzzling France? Wait a minute. Okay, Danny, says Vegan Family. You're right. Forget about saturated fat. Great, I would love to. We could never talk about it again and I would be stoked. Because it always ends up turning into vegetarians live longer, or vegetarians and vegans live longer. Or it ends up turning into a vegetarians and vegans are healthier overall thing all the time anyway. If you were to hear certain kinds of vegans tell the story, their skin is more radiant, they never go gray, they never go bald, their bones never fracture, they only need 3.5 hours of sleep every night. Speaking of nighttime, they have incredible night vision. They're immune to the common cold. I'm a vegan and I've never been sick in 10 years. And even though it is supposed to be meat eaters that allegedly yoke their masculinity to their dietary patterns, this particular kind of vegan is always super anxious to show you all of his studies about how vegans have less erectile dysfunction than meat eaters, and they just cannot seem to let a conversation expire or end without talking to you about how their boners are harder than depleted uranium rounds. This type of vegan dude is just absolutely certain that if he wasn't so busy making stuff for his Etsy account, he could fertilize, very respectfully by the way, his very willing vegan wife from 20 feet away if he needed to. Okay, where were we? I forgot what we were talking about. Oh yeah, I remember now. We're all healthier and we just live longer. When all the dust settles, it does really always end up being this singular, particular claim that seems to matter most and truly stand out. That claim being that vegetarians and vegans live longer than meat eaters. So, what is the price of tea in China? I mean, what is the life expectancy in France? Circling back around. It's currently standing at 83.13 years. They must eat a ton of animal products, however, to have such a very high saturated fat intake, right? Well, it could be coconut oil, so let's not rush to judgment, okay? Let's just double check. Let's talk for a second casually about the French. Let's talk about the French and their legendary levels of consumption of animal products. You might have heard about French bread and the red wine, and you might think that somehow makes up a bulk of their diet, but let's just talk just for a second real quick about what these pretentious, post-everything, beret-wearing dorks actually eat. With a culture and a cuisine that is so deeply in love with meat in all of its forms, avoiding eating it in France is a tricky business. There is a very small minority of There's a very small minority of non-meat eaters in the country. More than the 20 who demonstrated today, but still teeny. 1 million people, or 1.5% of the French population, called themselves vegetarian in studies published in the late 1990s, although more recent estimates suggest that it might have grown to 2%. People say, I have been vegetarian for 23 years and it is getting easier, but there was a time when it was extremely difficult. I can concur. My husband's French grandmother, when faced with making me a lunch sans viande for the first time, said, that means no meat, by the way, for the first time said, no problem, I'll cook chicken. No problem, I'll cook chicken. I thought Americans were supposed to be the uncultured Philistines. Turns out that the French think chicken are vegetables too. From another article relevant to the subject, real quick like, an exciting time for vegetarians living in France. As a vegetarian living in a forgotten corner of rural southwest France, I'd long resigned myself to difficulties eating out and quizzical looks from my French neighbors. But change is definitely in the air. Back in the early 90s, when I first started to involve myself in French life, the reaction to my dietary choice was rarely accepting. I had chefs tell me my diet was an insult to French culture, waiters telling me that ham isn't meat, blank incomprehension and outright refusal to feed me. I was even told that I couldn't possibly be a vegetarian because, well, I'd be dead if I didn't eat meat. Sometimes I'd find a restaurant willing to discuss my diet, but the chef would usually demand to know what I could eat. He couldn't conceive of a plate of food without meat as the main event, and he seemed to think I'd be happy with a plate of boiled veg. So, what do we know? We know the French eat a lot of fucking meat, homie. If you still don't believe that, although I think that should be enough, that and the saturated fat data, but if you still don't believe that, here's an awesome graph that shows per capita intake of animal products when compared to the global average as sort of a percentage of daily calories. I can't remember exactly how they determined it, but let's take a look at the graph, at the global map. This graph is awesome because it is a sum total of animal product consumption in France, leads the entire world in the consumption of animal products. So I know it says meat, but if you look into this, it really isn't just meat, it's animal products total. Only people on the actual carnivore diet are outdoing them. Their diet is as animal-based as it gets. Turns out the French are practically anti-vegans. Well done, well done. And I don't think we can accuse them of yoking their masculinity to their dietary patterns the same way that vegans are able to accuse American men of doing. And just to be clear, I don't do that. I yoke my masculinity to my competence making YouTube videos. So it's fragile, but not super fragile. Okay, now we're gonna talk about life expectancy after I have a sip of beer here. But first, a couple caveats. Firstly, meat consumption or animal product consumption is not the only relevant health behavior as far as life expectancy goes. However, hardcore vegans, not my intelligent vegan fans, not my vegan family, but the crazies, the vegoons, act like it is. Act like all that matters is animal consumption. They act like there aren't other huge, incredibly important and relevant health behaviors to this equation. Meat is so incredibly toxic and completely detrimental to human health that it should be just consuming it on the regular should be reflected in the lifespan that the normal lifespans that people live, or average life expectancies. At least they say this or they assert this when it's convenient for their narrative. I doubt they'll be doing so after the end of this video. That's fine. I'm totally okay with that. I really am. Like, we can ignore and not talk about a single other relevant health behavior. We're not going to need to, as you'll see, as you'll soon find out. For now, we will ignore all of those other differences and just compare and contrast vegetarians and vegans, or vegetarians and vegans as a group, right? To meat eaters at the highest possible level of abstraction. Okay, pay attention now, okay? Because all we're gonna do is glance at the issue from a distance. all we're going to do is glance at the issue from the highest level, because the vegan crazies are telling us that even without adjusting for any other relevant health behaviors, that vegans and vegetarians live significantly longer lives than their meat-eating counterparts. Capiche? Do they really, though? Do they really? I'm only going to say this tens of thousands of more times. In fact, this is going to be my fucking hobby horse from here on out.
There is almost perfect overlap between the countries that consume the most meat and the most animal products and the countries that have the longest life expectancies.
We should actually call these countries blue countries, but that would disrupt the narrative, so we're probably not going to do that. Well, I'm going to do that, but that's why we don't do that. In fact, let's go over some of the data here real quick. From this chart here of the most meat consuming countries of the world, ranked by annual meat consumption per capita in pounds in 2013, we've got Australia, Israel, New Zealand, Canada, South Korea. Okay. If we look at this other chart here, again, this one says meat intake, but it's actually animal products total, and we can look into that if you'd like, but it does say it right here on the chart. And you'll see on this chart, France, New Zealand, Denmark, Austria, Iceland, Finland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Ireland, Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, Germany, Australia, Italy. Okay, and then now lastly, okay, we're going to look at a lifespan expectancy chart, and we're just going to go by both sexes, and we're going to rank them, and we're going to look for some countries that we just saw. Hong Kong was on there. They have the highest meat consumption in the world, but they weren't on that chart because they're not technically a country, I guess. Switzerland, there's Switzerland. There's Singapore. They also have high meat consumption, but they weren't on there. Italy, Spain, Australia, that's just in the top 10 there. Including Iceland in the top 10. South Korea just outside the top 10. Israel, Sweden, France coming in at 12, 13, and 14. Canada in there at 16. Norway at 17. Ireland, 18. Greece, they weren't on the list. Oh, yeah, they were on the list. Greece, the Netherlands, rounding it off at number 21. Those are all first world countries, man. That's why they're living that long. I thought we weren't going to adjust for anything like that, but okay, whatever, fine. Then the vegan says there has to be like some huge or large first world contingent or cohort of first world vegetarians and vegans that live significantly longer lives than these people. There just has to be, I know it. That's 𝙈𝙤𝙖𝙩 and the Adventist Health Studies 2 cohorts, and that just isn't the case, vegan family. Sorry. Depending on how you define significant, of course. Let's take a look, though, shall we, and see. From an article on the subject, I'm just going to quote directly from it because I'm just being lazy today. 𝙈𝙤𝙖𝙩 leads the country in longevity. That's this country, America. I don't know where the rest of you are all at, but that's where I'm at right now. Well, I'm in central Washington, which is like America, but not quite. 𝙈𝙤𝙪 leads the country in longevity. While the average American woman will live to be 81, the average vegetarian, notice I said vegetarian, Adventist woman in 𝙈𝙤𝙪 will on average live to be 86. Wow, that's 5 years. While the average American man will live to be 76, the average vegetarian Adventist man in 𝙈𝙤𝙪 will live to be 83. That's 8 years, or close to 8 years. But wow, 86 instead of 81 for women, and 83 instead of 76 for men. Huge difference. Okay, so let's just say you think that is a huge difference. We're gonna see what you think about the rest of these differences. Remember now, that's completely, however, unadjusted, uncorrected, and uncontrolled for differences in life expectancy. But 86 for the vegetarian women and 83 for the vegetarian men in America. Am I supposed to be in awe of those numbers? Like, is it supposed to strike me as impressive? So the vegetarian Adventist women in Loma Linda, they live just about as long as the women, uncontrolled, unadjusted for, in Australia, France, Italy, Singapore, South Korea, Spain, and Switzerland. Wow. And the vegetarian Adventist men in Loma Linda live just about 2 years, or actually we'll say less than 2 years longer than the men from Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, Iceland, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Singapore, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland. The vegetarian inhabitants of this so-called blue zone live to be just about the same fucking age as the inhabitants of some of the most meat-eatingest, saturated fat chuggingest countries on the planet. That's really fascinating. Wait a minute, what I actually meant to say was, nobody cares!
Nobody cares.
Wait. No, what I really meant to say was, who gives a shit?
Who gives a shit?
Is Mike the Vegan going to try to claim now that the Australians, Canadians, Dutch, French, Irish, Italian, Spanish, and Swiss peoples that we base all of these life expectancy statistics on just don't actually eat that much meat like he did about the people from Hong Kong? Would even the stupidest, the very stupidest and most ideological vegan we can drum up in our minds really try to claim that this level of meat eating in these countries and animal product consumption is a relatively new thing that's perhaps going to somehow catch up with the relative life expectancies of these nations? There's no way he would do that. He would have to know that such a claim would be seen for the ridiculously transparent, unjustifiable special pleading that it clearly was. How far can the goalpost possibly shift? Are animal products fucking toxic or not? Does 10,000 pounds of meat and who knows how many pounds of eggs and dairy consumed over your lifetime subtract a significant number of years off your life or not? If so, then somebody should explain to the millions of people that are in Australia, Canada, France, Hong Kong, Ireland, Israel, Italy, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland that are forgetting to die young that they should get to it. If this isn't enough to put this issue for rest for you, and it really, really should be, we shouldn't even have to talk about this stupid idea anymore. But if it's not, for some reason, we're going to keep pushing forward and we are going to drive a stake through this claim once and for all, and we're going to make it crystal clear. From an article at The Conversation called "Do Vegetarians Live Longer? Probably, but not because they're vegetarians." It's this last factor that we set out to investigate. There are several existing studies on the impact of vegetarianism on health, but the results are mixed. A 2013 study which followed more than 95,000 men and women in the United States from 2002 to 2009. Actually, as we'll see later, it was more like 73,308 men and women after exclusions, unjustifiable exclusions in my opinion, and it was from 2002 to 2007, but don't let that detract from your view of the publication. It is great. They found vegetarians had a 12% lower risk of death from all causes than non-vegetarians. They're talking about, again, the vegetarian dietary patterns and mortality in the Adventist Health Study 2 study. Firstly, and this is a big one, this study of Seventh-day Adventists determined on its own terms that pesco-vegetarians actually live longest. Pesco-vegetarian is just a fancy way of saying health-conscious meat eater. The overwhelming majority of the vegetarians in this study, by the way, were actually lacto-ovo-vegetarians. Lacto-ovo-vegetarian is a fancy way of saying health-conscious animal product consumer. Only 8% of the people in this study were vegans. Secondly, not only did they find that pesco-vegetarians actually lived the longest, they also found that this link between being a vegetarian, note well, vegetarian, not vegan, and living longer, holding because they did not properly adjust their own study. This is true of most of the studies of vegetarians and vegans that purport to show some kind of longevity benefit to vegetarianism or veganism. as our friends who are writing the article make clear here. So, from the same piece, it is important to acknowledge that in most studies, vegetarians tend to be the health-conscious people with overall healthier lifestyle patterns than the norm. For example, among the Sachs Institute's 45 and up participants, vegetarians were less likely than non-vegetarians to report smoking, drinking excessively, insufficient physical activity, and being overweight or obese. They were also less likely to report having heart or metabolic disease or cancer at the start of the study. In most previous studies, vegetarians did have lower risk of early death from all causes, and this is important now, listen to me, in unadjusted analysis. However, after controlling for other lifestyle factors such as the ones listed above, the risk reduction often decreased significantly or even completely vanished. This suggests other characteristics beyond abstinence from meat may contribute to better health among vegetarians. Remember, abstinence doesn't work. More simply, it's the associated healthier behaviors that generally come along with being a vegetarian, such as not smoking, maintaining a healthy body weight, exercising regularly, that explain why vegetarians tend to have better health outcomes than non-vegetarians. So it isn't the vegetarianism explaining it. We're going to address some of the particular adjustment issues with this study, the Adventist Health Study 2, right now. But in part 2 of this video, or maybe 3 if I split this video up into 2 parts, we're going to go over the whole study, some objections that an Adventist raised to this study. We're going to add some nuance to this whole topic, if nuance is your thing. If not, just watch this video. For now, however, I'll just note that some kind readers of the study took it upon themselves to point out in a letter to the editor of the journal that published the study a couple of the glaring issues with the study that I noticed as well when I was reading the study. They noted that there was a lack of adjustment for body mass index. That means that they didn't adjust for BMI. The people that wrote the letter to the editor go over that in detail, but I'm just going to read the response from the authors of the study. They say, "We thank 𝙤𝙤 and 𝙤𝙤𝙖𝙩 for their correspondence regarding adjustment for BMI. We disagree with the assertion that adiposity, BMI is of course a proxy for adiposity, is not part of the causal pathway relating dietary patterns to mortality. In our article, Table 2 suggests an association of dietary pattern with BMI. Of course, it only does that at their level of granularity, which is fine. You can say vegans have healthier BMIs if you want, but you can't say vegans have healthier BMIs than carnivores like Dr. Paul Saladino. An analysis of covariance demonstrates this to be significant after adjustment for age, sex, race, exercise, and energy intake. Dietary pattern may plausibly affect BMI causally. I mean, I believe it does. I have a much finer level of granularity than vegan or meat eater. It is generally believed that adiposity causally contributes to mortality. It does. Thus, a potential causal pathway from dietary pattern to mortality with BMI as an intermediate is suggested." Yeah, sure. But again, the line should not just be vegan versus meat eater or vegetarian versus meat eater. There are other dietary patterns that go along or that are intra-specific between those dietary categories. Anyway, it is an independent risk factor and it should have been adjusted for, and it wasn't. Secondly, they noted, just like I think I did above, when I suggested to you that in fact it wasn't 96,000 people in the study, it was only like 70,000, and they wrote the letters to the editor. In the letter to the editor, they wrote, "Lastly, about 12,000, so 11,956 potential participants had a prior diagnosis of cancer or of cardiovascular disease. That is 12% of the total cohort. Bearing in mind that the average age at baseline was approximately 58 years, the proportion of subjects with a serious condition was high." Sure, but they excluded them from the study. So they just went, hey, all these unhealthy, who knows what, lacto-vegetarians, vegans, they just got rid of them, took them out of the study. So we don't know. And they explain their reasoning for that, but I'm not going to go over it. And here's what I do want to suggest. I wonder if there's some sort of reason for why that's beyond their offered or proffered up reason. And I wonder if some sort of bias creeps in to nutrition research when a sect of fanatically religious zealots gets involved in nutrition research. Thirdly, these results These results, right, showing a benefit to vegetarianism and veganism as far as life expectancy is concerned, have never been replicated in another study, or they're just generally not replicated in another study. Let's check out some of the other studies that either intentionally or unintentionally included vegetarians and vegans and compared them to non-vegetarians in the study group and see what they found out. From an article about one of the longevity studies in Australia. Australia is home to one of the largest ongoing studies of healthy aging in the Southern Hemisphere. It's the Sachs Institute's 45 and Up study. We followed a total of 267,180 men and women over an average of 6 years. During the follow-up period, 16,836 participants died. When we compared the risk of early death for vegetarians and non-vegetarians while controlling for a range of other factors, we did not find any statistical difference. Put more simply, when we crunched the data, we found vegetarians did not have a lower risk of early death compared with meat-eating counterparts. Bam! Okay, Daniel, well, do British vegetarians? Okay. Among 64,234 participants aged 20 to 89, for whom the diet group was known, 2,965 had died before age 90 by 30th of June 2007. The death rates of participants are much lower than average for the United Kingdom. The standardized mortality ratio for all causes of death was 52% and was identical in vegetarians and non-vegetarians. Again, the conclusions of the study. The mortality of both the vegetarians and non-vegetarians in the study is low compared with national rates. This is because they were studying health-conscious people. Within the study, mortality from circulatory diseases and all causes is not significantly different between vegetarians and meat eaters. And if you just go through PubMed for a while, that's a phrase you're gonna find a lot. Not significantly different death rates between vegetarians and meat eaters. There were 5,294 deaths before age 90 and greater than 1 million years of follow-up. There was no significant difference in overall or all-cause mortality between the diet groups. Okay, Daniel, do German vegetarians. Okay, family, let's do German vegetarians. A cohort study of vegetarians and health-conscious persons in Germany, followed up prospectively for 21 years. What did they find out? I don't know. What did they find out? Within the cohort, vegetarian compared with non-vegetarian diet had no overall effect on mortality. What were their conclusions? Both vegetarian and non-vegetarian health-conscious persons in the study have reduced mortality compared with general population. Okay, Daniel, now do French vegetarians. I would, but I couldn't actually find a study on French vegetarians, probably because there's not a significant number of them, enough of them to do a study on. What's great about a lot of these studies is that they compared healthy vegetarians, right, or health-conscious vegetarians to health-conscious meat eaters. And no, vegan family, health-conscious meat eaters is not an oxymoron. Once we do that, we find that the alleged benefits of vegetarianism disappeared. The truth is that vegetarians, and I know you guys don't want to hear this, but the truth is, well, maybe some of you want to hear this. The truth is that vegetarians and vegans don't live longer lives, family. And it does not pain me or bring me any pain to say this because I'm not in a fucking cult. They don't live shorter lives either. Hooray! However, and it does pain me to say this a little bit, just a little bit, but that's because
diet just does not fucking matter that much.
Beyond a certain threshold. You would not know this, however, if all that you consumed was regular nutritional media, because everyone's trying to sell you something, except me. I'm just trying to tell you to get over the fact that you're gonna die. Now that we know all this, I'm going to pose to you what I believe would be some intelligent questions. Ask yourself the following questions. Would an intelligent and informed person even be asking questions about vegetarianism and veganism based upon the life expectancy data we've gone over? Do they, vegetarians and vegans, even survive long enough to be worthy of hypothesis generation? No, they don't. And then lastly, how much longer should we as a people, right, as species, even be living as far as life expectancy is concerned? That is, at what life expectancy would you assume that the meat industry isn't trying to secretly or surreptitiously poison you and kill you? At 90? At 100? Honestly though, if you can't get it done in 80 years, I really don't think that you're gonna get it done in 90 or 100 years either. You probably won't do it in 104 years either, which is in fact the theoretical maximum life expectancy for our species. That of course is average lifespan, not to be confused with theoretical maximum average life, or theoretical maximum lifespan, which is like 120 something. This is what it really boils down to. Overall mortality is identical for health-conscious vegetarians and vegans and health-conscious meat eaters. Both of these groups compare favorably to people who are not health-conscious. That's it. Anybody trying to tell you anything differently than that is not your friend. All they're trying to do is sell you a vegan strong box or some bullshit supplements for carnivores. In some pretty big and comprehensive senses with specific regard to life expectancy. It simply does not matter what you eat past a certain sanity threshold. That is, don't be chugging soda all day with Pop Rocks or Sour Patch Kids and then washing that down with pizza and fried chicken, okay? There's a sanity check. It simply does not matter what you eat past a certain basic nutritional threshold. No matter how much weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth the members of the dietary cults do about it, okay? Say it with me. Say it with me and click your heels together. Diet is not about lifespan. Diet is not about lifespan. Diet is not about lifespan. But do remember that we're not talking about how long you're gonna live, but we are talking about how slow you're gonna die. What I don't want for you is thrice weekly sessions of dialysis. And what I definitely don't want for you is to be having your fucking extremities chopped off in between your thrice weekly 3 to 4 hour sessions of dialysis. Dude, that's a full-time job. Okay, it's not a full-time job, but that's 12 hours a week of getting your blood filtered on top of your full-time job, if you can even work, if you even still have your feet. How do we make sure that we die fast and leave a good-looking corpse at the end of our completely average but completely enjoyable lives? Well, you can find out by clicking on my Eat for Death video series when the end card pops up there in the upper right-hand corner of the screen at the end of this video and find out. Or if you want to know what the best vegetarian and non-vegetarian diets have in common, you can click on my diet do's and don'ts video in the lower right-hand corner when that pops up at the end screen. It's a choose your own adventure. I know that this was per usual, quite a bit to chew on, no pun intended. But if you stuck around, it means you must have liked it. And if you could just click the like button down there and or down there, wherever it is, and just to let YouTube know that you liked it, that would really help me out. Do not forget, in fact, carry this with you throughout the week as you go about your business, that you are beautiful, capable, and strong, and that means that you can deal with whatever fate cooks up and sends your way this week. It's your boy Danny reminding you to eat meat, move weight, and not to stress out about being a perfectly average person, living a perfectly average life for a perfectly average length of time, doing perfectly average things because perfectly average people still live long enough to get it done. Chuck-a-deuce! Remember to choose your next adventure when those cards pop up at the end screen, yo!